There was too many issues that were too difficult to solve in too short a time. That's the quick summary. Also, there were some very sticky domestic processes which didn't deliver, namely, particularly the US didn't come to the table with what had been anticipated in setting up this conference, which was set up really on a 2-year schedule. So that produced all sorts of problems. And I think the logistics and the way in which it was managed as well, with time literally running out at the end for different groups of countries to have consultations on how they wanted to go forward, really meant that you had a bit of a failure in terms of the final agreement and how it could be adopted under the UNFCCC. Even though things are not looking great in the US, I think that there is a great deal of momentum building up in other countries and a realization that you can't stand still and wait for the US forever, and that in fact a way of bringing pressure to bear on the US is to actually show some degree of determination in moving forward. I think also that the management of the whole proceedings is likely to be far more smoother, with much greater consultations going on amongst parties led by the Mexican hosts, which are sort of bearing fruit, I think. I think officially you'll still see a lot of intransigence. This is grandstanding and negotiation tactics. But underneath there are things that are, I think, moving forward at the speed that you would kind of expect at this stage. The UK has been a very good model and a good ambassador also for the EU generally in forging alliances and speaking for a low carbon vision of development. It's still got a long way to go domestically, but there are things happening that the UK can credibly point to, so it has some degree of credibility. Also, its role in ensuring that financial assistance isn't cut and that they're trying to meet their target, their ODA targets, and coming forward with climate financing. So if the new government can keep those promises and improve on them and improve the leadership that the UK has, particularly in supporting developing countries that want to play a progressive role, I think that would be very helpful.
The other problem which happened in that initial architecture, in my view, was the separation, which seemed perfectly rational at the time, between the Annex I countries and the non-Annex I countries. In other words, the developed countries which would take on obligations and the less industrialized countries that wouldn't. And clearly that's been one of the motivations, for example, behind China wanting to keep the Kyoto Protocol in place at Copenhagen, because it actually absolved them from the responsibility. So I think the whole architecture has been flawed since the very beginning. And in my view, that there's a lot of aspects of climate change which could be much better dealt with in a more decentralized way through multilateral agreements among countries within particular regions, or even at subnational levels, such as the level of the city. We have 50% of the world's population living in cities at the present moment. City governments have the ability actually to change a lot more on the ground more quickly than do national governments. And it's very telling, I think, if we look at the US, where people often assume that there is little or nothing happening on the climate change policy front. If you actually look at the state level, California for example, or you look at the city level, you'll find that there's actually quite a considerable amount of activity that's going on at those levels, which have the potential to have traction on the problem in a way that relying on the US federal government to do so, I think will mean that we'll be hanging around for a very long time. The total investment in energy in the US, energy research, and this includes things like fusion energy and nuclear and coal, as well as renewables, is about $8 billion a year. I think it needs to be about 10 times that amount, which would then make it comparable to the amount that the US currently spends each year on military research and development. Not military expenditure, military research and development. One of the motivations that I have for supporting this idea of a program that focuses on energy modernization rather than on emissions controls is precisely because we have, for example, 1.6 billion people in the world who don't have access to electrical power at the moment. And if we were to look at the amount of increased capacity, the number of terawatts we would have to have available to bring secure, safe electricity to that 1.6 billion, you can't do it with the existing clean fossil fuels that we have available. Those high-end fossil fuels are much in demand in the industrialized world, but they're not going to be available at an affordable cost in the places where people don't have access to electricity.
It is the most important transformation in the world, the rise of emerging economies. So these are big developing countries, and they have at times provided a leadership role also to other developing countries. So if you think of countries like Brazil or China or South Africa, they have provided the kind of regional leadership roles that you sometimes see in the UN and in other global forums. But their rise, in a sense, changes the dynamic of negotiating an agreeable limit. So for developed countries, the change in consumption, which is the crucial part of countering climate change, is not the primary cause of greenhouse gas emissions by developing countries. For them, it's production. So what you end up with is a much more fragmented set of self-interest. So for developing countries, it's very clear that what they want is to not allow the climate change agenda to affect the cost of their development. And for developed countries, they have to alter behavior. So you can already see the two sides are quite disparate. But I think what came out in our panel was a consensus that the middle ground between these two issues is an agreement on technology and financing. But I would also add a change of behavior by developed countries to lead by example. Having industrialized, they are in a position to change their consumption behavior, so they should be able to agree more ambitious targets than the developing countries. But to allow the developing countries to cope with climate change and to not go down the path of developed countries, I think there has to be an appreciation that in order for the world to go down a more sustainable path, a sharing of technology and financing absolutely has to be there. And I think that was actually one of the more promising things that came out of Copenhagen, was this recognition that much more transfers of funds and technologies had to be agreed in order to get the developing world the help they need to cope with climate change. I think it's still going to come down to technology and finance. I think that globalization has certainly meant that there has been, in a sense, an outsourcing of carbon industries to the developing world. And this is a process, a global economic structural change process where the Western world is deindustrializing, which by definition means that they are going to trade in goods and produce in the services sector. The developing world takes that on. But that's just one more argument for having a much better mechanism of technology and financing so that you can push the whole world towards a more sustainable carbon path and not just focused on what everybody has to cut, sort of in an atomistic way, which lots of developing countries do not think is feasible for their own development.